Right. Okay, so Joe, if you put the deck up. We're not going to spend a lot of time on presentational stuff because we want to get into the Q&A, which was the main point. So welcome everybody. Thanks for joining on time as well. So that's really good. Yeah, so the intention of this one is that this time round, in round 2, we decided to do the playbacks a little later in the process because for round 1, it was more about getting people familiar with the plan. A lot of people hadn't really thought about the plan at that stage, so we did it right at the beginning to provide an introduction. This time we thought we would do it at the kind of the second week, towards the back end of the second week of the consultation period, because it would give you a chance to look at the documents in more detail and probably come with more questions. And obviously I have with myself, Jason and Kate, who will be able to provide specific feedback and hopefully answer your questions as they come up. So I'll briefly just skate through the intro and we'll get to the meat of the conversation, if that's okay. And as usual, if you have questions while I'm speaking or if we get into Q&A, we'll do it by hands. So we kind of take first in, first out approach to questions as we go through as well, which seems to work fairly well. So round 2. Round 1, as you know, was a fairly general introduction to the plan. A lot of assumptions, ambiguities, no specific dates, although those that wanted to could probably work some dates out. The intention this time around was to provide a plan with dates, which we did by way of an illustrative timeline, and we also provided supporting documents for that. So the intention was to demonstrate some progress. We did demonstrate some progress, I believe, in terms of being clear about the migration approach that we're likely to kind of use as the basis for the plan when it's baselined. We probably haven't made as much progress on the qualification area, which I'm sure we'll discuss. You know, I think we gave a lot more information in terms of our assumptions and options around SIT and how it might work and how people might participate. So there has been progression. It's not been, you know, it's not a complete full plan with fully progressed topics, but as we've always said, planning is a process and it hopefully gets clearer over time. The question will be what happens at the end of round 2 and how do we proceed, which I'll come on to in a minute. So we have provided this. We truncated the round 2 process by a week because we felt that once round 2 replies are in, we're expecting there to be more, and we're expecting to be more detailed this time round. We wanted time to absorb those properly, but also time to engage with yourselves and other stakeholders, particularly senior stakeholders like Ofgem, IPA and so on, because as a result of round 2, we should be starting to be more directive about what the plan is likely to be as we go through the process. So it's really, as we said, round 2 is the kind of tipping point and the really important place where we want to do justice to your replies. Next slide. The outcome of, if the next slide arrives, it's obviously a bit of a time lag. The important thing on this slide is really the outcome of round 2. The outcome, we want to increasingly identify the best approaches and assumptions and the durations of activities to get as close as we think we can to the existing timetable. And we want to get an output from round 2 that is good enough for us to move into a final round 3 consultation period, because that round 3 is only a couple of weeks and it should be kicking the tires on what should be a fairly solid plan. And that gap between round 2 and round 3, as I said, is really to make sure that we've had good conversations with people and increasingly getting people on the same page. Right, next slide is probably more to do with what we have provided. If we can go to slide 4, yeah. So we provided the plan, provided dates, Microsoft project plan this time, and updated and developed RAID beyond that, which we showed you the first time round. We also outlined an additional, well, I say plan on the page, it is a timeline, it's a more challenging timeline that we wanted you to look at and provide another data point and a basis for feedback. So whilst we gave you an illustrative plan on a page, what we call PoaP 1, with all the underpinning documents, which is a plan that we're throwing out there for comment. It's that PoaP 1 is some distance away from the timetable. And whilst people may feel it's a realistic and achievable timeline, it may not be the the shortest realistic and timeline and practical timeline. So that's one of the things we're asking for views on. But part 2 is not a plan. It's a timeline which has no underpinning documentation to it anywhere. We haven't produced any. This was more of a top-down, logical, rational approach, which removes all contingency. In an ideal world, a kind of, I would say, more of an ecstatic path than a happy path is probably the best way of characterizing it. But the important thing for part 2 is to recognize it's a device to allow you to kind of portray your thinking about both the part 1 and the part 2 in terms of your responses. We felt it was important because we're kind of moving more towards a plan which may have a range of dates in it, which reduces the ambiguity but recognizes that planning is a process that improves over time, and as you deliver and as your estimates get clearer and as the assumptions become less, the plan becomes more certain. So having something that may have a range of dates in it is quite likely, in the same way that, for example, faster switching had a range of go live dates. We may end up with a range of dates in a plan at this stage, but in order to do that, we wanted to show you a part 1 and a part 2 that does give you a range of dates based on a really happy path and based on a more realistic or possible, less challenging timeline. But we are all expected, including ourselves, by the way, to provide evidence as to why we can't meet the timeline, the timetable that currently is the baseline, and why we can't meet the challenge timeline either. So you and we all need to ask ourselves, can we do these things? If we can, how? If we can't, why not? As I said in a previous playback session this morning, we need you to give us the negative responses as well as the positives. So if you say you can do it, it will take this long, you tell us why. But also, if you say you can't do it, we need to know why not. So you need the evidence for both negative and positive scenarios so that we can, if you like, interpolate between all the information that we get back and come up with a plan that we can tell you we think is the most reasonable one to go forward with. So the challenging timeline is only that, as you've probably read and established, but it is important to take it seriously because it does have thinking in it which might be useful in any baseline plan, and we'll come on to that a little bit later. So again, we shortened the round 2, but we also said we would reduce the number of questions. We've significantly reduced the number of questions, but of course the answers are quite clearly articulated that we're expecting to get back, and we've always said that the effort in the answers is going to be greater, even though the questions are less. And we've tried to frame them to solicit that quantified response, evidence response from you. And it's really important that you tell us everything you're currently thinking. We do realise that, based on an M3 milestone at the end of October, which requires every participant to have produced high-level plans going forward, that some of you may not yet have those plans fully in place and may be developing them. But what we need to know is your current thinking. If you have a plan, great, that's good evidence that we can look at. If you're developing a plan, then show us what you've got and tell us what your thinking is at this stage, what assumptions or estimates you're making, with whatever caveats that you want to put into there. So you may say that you estimate a duration for a task is this, but you've got a number of other things to do before you can be sure about it. We just want transparency and openness about this kind of information that we're soliciting. And as I've said many times, without you providing that to us, it's not an industry program, it's not an industry plan, it's not something you can sign up to. We can't do it without you. We want to be able to go back to the IPA or to Ofgem and explain why a timeline is longer in this area than may be otherwise expected. But it shouldn't just be our view, it should be a consensus view supported by quantifiable information. So we'll go into bat with you, we continue to go into bat for you and with you, but you have to be part of that team, so don't expect us to do it all. And I don't want to be in a position with a lack of information to be, if you like, telling you what the plan will be. We are trying to do this as much as possible as an exercise across industry. I think you've got that point before. We want to maintain the integrity of that exercise. We want to, be as good as our word. But we all recognise the pressures that there are on this programme. Ofgem I've very clearly articulated how important this programme is for enabling a number of other net zero programmes. So there is political pressure, there's regulatory pressure. You know, we can't divorce ourselves from that. We all have to try to do our best to get this programme delivered as quickly as possible, but with manageable risk, and that's where we need your help. Right, the next slide is, if I can remember what it is. Yeah, we said we'd provide some ideas about evidence required, and you know, we have also asked Ofgem what they'd like to see, and ideally they'd like to see plans. So where you have plans, or even if you have draft plans or excerpts of plans, all of that is the best kind of evidence at this stage. It's evidence of your increasing readiness for M3, of course, but it's also evidence that you've done some proper thinking and you're not just saying it's too hard. So the first, second, and third priority for Ofgem in terms of evidence is plans. But we've also suggested other things, and also just thinking and rationale, logical, you know, logic around why you think that the way we're doing things won't work very well for you, or if you don't have good plans, you can at least tell us the approach that would be ideal for you. So if you had your way, you'd like the plan to look like this because it would be easier due to X, Y, Z, and just show us the challenges and the way that you would like to overcome them, and how you think the programme plan should support that. So there's a range of different ideas on this slide about evidence, which may or may not be helpful, but it is the first one. Primarily, that takes primacy. That's the really credible evidence that would allow us to go into bat with all our senior stakeholders and say, well, there's some very good reasons here why it's going to take longer than the timetable says. That's the position I'd like to be in. It's not because I want to prove it's going to take longer. I want to be able to prove that if it takes longer, it's still the earliest realistic timetable that we can achieve to try to get close to what Ofgem are looking for. Then the last two slides are just the PoaPs. So the illustrative programme plan, which has all the underpinning evidence, and we've called out the kind of the differences in timescales between milestones and the timetable. We've called out a SIT approach here, which I'm sure we'll speak about in the session. And in the second part 2, we've also called out a slightly different SIT approach, which is a bit more radical and a bit, you know, a bit more hard-nosed, but would allow us to go potentially more quickly, provided that central parties, i.e. some of you, will be ready in time, because of course you're on the critical path. So what we're saying to some of the other participants is they need to get with the programme, they need to get on with it, because if central parties are ready, and if we are ready as the SI, then we don't want to be waiting around for suppliers and agents, so on, to be joining the party at that stage. So we want to be in a position to kind of be on the front foot with these things. So I think I've explained enough context around the challenge timeline. I think you know what it's there for. I'm going to shut up now because it's 15 minutes in, and we said we'd have, I think, 45 minutes for Q&A. So we're all here to answer questions. Now you've had a chance to chew on the documents we sent you, and I'm sure that there are some ambiguities or things that you'd like to make clearer as you're concocting your responses to us, which are due by the end of next week. Any questions, or what are the questions that people would like to raise? I remember last time Lee came with about half a dozen, well, a dozen probably. So if any of you have kind of prepared this, it would be very helpful. We probably also, in the absence of huge questions, could replay some of the points that we made earlier in an earlier playback session, but I'd rather reserve that for the back end of the session. I'd rather concentrate on what you guys want to know.
Joe, it's probably worth keeping the PoaP up.
Yeah, the illustrative one, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I'll reshare it.
Sorry.
Joel, well, should we just get the wheels moving, Kate?
Yeah, shall I just go through clarify some of the things that came up on the earlier call and talk through the philosophy behind SIT. So, Joe, if you can home in a little bit so that we can see the PoaP more clearly, especially the top 4 swim lanes. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, that's fine. Okay, so what we're trying to do, so this is PoaP number 1. This is the one that has the supporting Microsoft project detail under it. So the idea here was that we were staying with the same kind of timescale and same philosophy for the initial stage. So in other words, the impact assessment, planning, procurement, and DBT, we were sticking with what we had in round 1. So we've got the 5-month period up front, of which we've said 3 months is necessary before you get stuck into DBT, but you know there'll be some tail end stuff going on as well in parallel with DBT. So then we've got the DBT at 12 months as we had before. And we've clarified that a bit to say that that's the DBT for the services, in other words, for the data services. It's also the DBT on the supplier side for the DIP interfaces. In other words, it's all the stuff that we need for SIT to commence. And you can see on the central systems, we haven't distinguished between all your different central systems. We've just put them in as a block there, just for the sake of argument. Now, obviously, we've got dates, and you know we know that some of your plans are changing at the moment, so we can fill that in on the next round, and maybe put in some milestones for the different central systems. So, what this differs in a major way from round 1 is the way that we've treated SIT. So SIT in round 1 was a bit longer. It had things like migration being tested late, whereas now we've moved it to being tested relatively early, not at the very beginning of SIT, but relatively early. And we've taken a different approach to SIT altogether. So we've said, okay, people who wish to take part in SIT, whoever wishes to take part and can get ready in time, you can join SIT. And we've even given a sort of a 1-month let, whereby if you're aiming to be ready, but you're not quite ready in time, and you come in a few weeks later, that's absolutely fine. You know, we're allowing for that. And so we'll do the initial component integration. And then once things really get moving and we start doing, you know, flowing messages in a more end-to-end way to test the overall design, what we will do is we will look at how quickly each of the participants is moving. And then at a certain point, we'll rearrange things so that the participants who are, who are moving most quickly are kind of paired up with the others who are moving the most quickly. And I think this is something that people have seen in faster switching in particular, where you're dependent on other participants, that if the other participant has had some problems, that can slow you down if you haven't, and so on. So we're going to try to smooth that out. And the idea is to get a bunch of participants, and we've called it a minimum viable cohort. And it's obviously got to have, apart from all of your central systems, it's got to have whoever the DNO, IDNO representative is within SIT. It's got to have, you know, at least 1 or 2 data services, 1 or 2 suppliers, and so on and so forth. And to get that cohort through SIT as quickly as possible, and then having come through SIT, dropping into sandbox execution, and then dropping into going live as early as possible. And what we've done is we've said that we're planning on having the central systems live slightly before the participants. In actual practice, I think some of you may well have your systems live, but not actually using this functionality earlier than that. And that's an enabler, and that's in order to get the most flexibility, so we can get some participants live as early as possible. So then the idea is that, you know, SIT, the point of SIT is proving that the end-to-end solution works according to the design, and that will have been proved when we've got the minimum viable cohort through. The other SIT participants who are not testing quite as quickly as that will carry on, and they can carry on in SIT, and they can also go live in a relatively accelerated way, but probably not as quickly as the MVC guys. And then we've got the participants who are going the qualification route, and that's kind of standard in the way that we've talked about. And again, for qualification, you guys are central systems, you're going to have to stand up test systems that can be used for qualification testing and so on and so forth. So that none of that's changed. It's just the philosophy of trying to get at least a minimum cohort through SIT as quickly as possible, so that they can go live as early as possible. That's the basic idea behind this. Yeah, Matt, go ahead.
Sorry, it's chatting away on mute. Do we have an environment plan yet? Especially if we're looking at doing SIT, qualification, and end-to-end sandbox concurrently.
Yeah, so not yet. It's in development. I think what we've said so far is that we have an environment for SIT functional and SIT migration testing. We have a different environment for SIT non-functional, and we have a different environment for sandbox. And then potentially, so then there's discussion about other environments possibly to be used as sort of staging environments for patches while we're doing SIT and so on. But I think that's where we've got to on the minimum environments.
Okay, and would we need one for qualification as well?
Yeah, so
we'll get down that route as well.
Qualification and sandbox would be on the same environment.
Okay.
Yeah.
The next environments working group, Matt, is on the 4th of October. So
are you expecting, as part of the response to this, are you expecting an IA in terms of this is what it means, cost if we need to have X number of environments around, or are you just saying, can we deliver this on time?
I don't think we're asking for a formal IA on it. I think we are asking for the achievability of it. Sorry, Keith.
Well, yeah, obviously when we raise the CR on the plan, ultimately
Yeah.
there's a chance to impact assess then, but that's some time away.
Okay.
Sorry for jumping in, but a related question is that we can only compare the two different plans by knowing what the environments need to be. So having the environment plan is going to be really useful for Alex on Helix to be able to compare these two different plans.
Hey, maybe the best thing to do is to just share our latest version of where we are with the environments, bearing in mind it's a work in progress and people are going to have to make some assumptions around it.
I'm not sure that the different plans will have much of an effect on the environments. I'm saying that, and I'm trying to think why that shouldn't be the case.
This is why we're asking for it. Yeah,
it's going to affect timing, obviously, Lee. But in terms of the number of environments, I don't think it's going to vary between the different versions and flavors of the plan.
Yeah, it was just if there's more happening in parallel with a challenging plan. That's why we're trying to understand. Maybe the test activities differ on the more challenging plan, and is there more in parallel? So we to do the comparison between plans 1 and 2, we needed that extra support and detail.
Or turn around and in order to achieve the challenge timeline, what would you need? It'd be good to know, what you would need to support you in each of these cases. And that would be part of the response, the kind of response we'd be looking for in any case.
Yeah, I just think we can't do that unless we know what those environments need to be. We don't know what prep we need to do for those.
Okay, so one of the things that we plan on doing as a result of the earlier meeting we had is issue a bit more information about showing an overlay on this PoaP of a typical path through for a supplier. Now it's less relevant for you guys for the central systems, but basically we're issuing a bit more supplementary information because there were a lot of questions about it. So one of the things we can do, Lee, is at the same time just look at whether there's a difference in the environments between the plans, and as Jason said, put out a summary of what we're thinking currently on the environments as supplementary information to this.
Thanks for the thumbs up.
Thank you. Yes, I saw some waving. I didn't see who they were, but yeah. Yeah, Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, this is around the kind of, as you said, the flip of the migration. So I know you're kind of summarising this, but DBT of migration is currently planned to be later than that 12 months. And then you've got the migration starting within a month of that being completed. And with reverse migration coming in, you've also probably got a requirement for participants in SIT from the old agents. So I know you've collapsed it, but I think the migration might just need to be pulled out separately, just
So
because you've increased the risk.
Yeah, no, agreed. So what we planned on doing, and maybe we should put out some supplementary information on this as well, is you can see that we've got the migration design as a separate swim lane identified at the top, and the idea there is, that is going to happen through November and December, and it'll be finished by the end of the year, and that's the design. Obviously, it's got to be implemented after that. So what we were intending was that the SIT test that tests the migration, that tests the mechanics of the migration and the non-functional characteristics and things like that, the SIT test of that will not happen right at the front end of SIT. It'll happen relatively early, but not right at the front. And what we are intending is that what gets dropped into SIT initially does not include migration support for migration, does not include support for reverse migration, and that all of that can be dropped into SIT as a future code release. Now, again, we haven't determined at what point, but it will come a few months in, is the intention. And the idea there is we don't know how long that will take because we don't have the full design yet. So all we wanted to do was take it off the critical path.
Okay, but you've currently got it all migration SIT completing by the end of September, which seems optimistic.
Migration SIT completing by the end of September in 24.
Yeah. So you've got it starting in May.
Yeah.
The DBT assumed to be completed by the end of April for migration.
Yeah.
And then you got it running through to the end of September, and then I assume that is the bit that then is following on the critical path to drive everything else.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Let me have another look at that.
It just seems if and I don't know, because obviously the critical path is the summary level, but if you've got the critical path at the more detailed level, depending on that end of September date for complete testing of reverse migration with all the parties, including old agents, etc., etc.
Yeah,
that might be a bit of a challenge to everybody.
Okay, fair point. Let me have another look at that then.
I think it might be, Kate, I know that we sort of ran through it a little bit in the previous debrief. It might be worth thinking about how we present the SIT migration and that potential opportunity for 2 drops and things like that in this diagram. It's just finding that balance between dropping to the next level of detail and having too much in there, Steve.
Agreed. It's just I know why it's been done. It's not a criticism by any stretch of the imagination. It's just the boxes of the reverse migration, fine. But as soon as you drop down the next level, it kind of, for example, the DBT does not finish at the end of February.
It doesn't have to.
No. Exactly, but then the critical path is indicating that it in inverted commas must do, and yet the migration isn't. And
so I think
it's the balance between the summary and then the next level that it then nicest possible way fall apart or not.
I think the assumption with the critical path as it's set out in here, Steve, is that the migration isn't sitting on the critical path, and that the SIT execution is dependent on the delivery of DBT for the elements we're taking into, connectivity and functional testing and all of those things. But that is something that needs to be tested, because we need to understand, we've now issued our processes for migration and for reverse migration. So there's information out there for people to understand the impact on their systems and processes and DBT, and therefore, we need to check that the timescales we've got in here are reasonable given any build activities or test activities you might have associated with reverse migration. So, picking out the migration element of SIT will probably help with that. We just need to think about how we do that. But that's part of the challenge. Is one of the questions is around is around the ability to hit the timescales. Obviously, migration and the build test activities associated with reverse migration is a key element of that. And we have in the I think I'm right in saying in the Microsoft project plan and the associated Excel, we have split out migration as part of that, Kate and Joe. But it is worth looking at that next level down.
Yeah, let me look at that, Steve. I had to admit on the previous call, and I'll admit it to you guys, I've just got back from holiday, so trying to cast my mind back to some of this.
I say if the reason it's been put from April to September is because it's on the critical path, then that's a bigger problem than it's just been put from May to September because that's the earliest it could be done, but it can move by 6 months.
I think it's not the critical path, but let me look at it. Yeah.
That is the assumption underpinning it at the moment, Steve, that it's not on the critical path. Sorry, Kate, I'm probably a bit close to where we got to on it. But if that is a challenge, then we need to know.
Yeah.
And we are getting challenges back from. I mean, I know I can see who's on the call. We are getting challenges back from the migration working group on the impact of the reverse migration process, particularly on registration and some of the IDNO systems as well. So we do know there are challenges in there, but that's part of what we want to get coming back from this consultation is, there's an underpinning assumption that we are using the reverse migration approach. So we need to understand the impact on DBT timings and migration SIT as well as part of that.
Chandrani, go ahead.
Yeah, Kate, the question was around the SIT. So if the participants are joining in a different time, are we going to do an analysis on the dependencies? So at a certain point to run an end-to-end, if we come early, then what are the other participants should actually be there if we want to run end-to-end? And if they...
Yeah, so no, that's a good question. I mean, we won't, people won't be coming much later. We said in this plan that we're allowing a month's leeway because we don't want people, joining in a month later and then some 2 months late. Managing all that is just going to be too difficult. So we've allowed a bit of leeway, but we intend to start SIT before we start actually doing end-to-end exercising of the system. We've got to get enough people in there. So we've got to get enough data services, enough suppliers, all the components are all talking to each other. So absolutely. So before we start our proper functional testing, we will make sure that we've got enough. And then as, if other people are added in, other participants are added in, we have to join them up into the jigsaw puzzle as well. So managing that will be tricky, but we will absolutely make sure that we've got the right, the right components there so that we can do proper end-to-end.
Okay.
we have any other questions coming up? Were there any other subjects in the last session, Kate or Jason, that we...
Yeah, I was just looking. So another thing that we talked a bit about was, so this is kind of less relevant to you, but this idea of what's a typical path through this. So we will put that out as additional information. And then the other thing that we talked a bit about was qualification, which again, you know, is not so relevant to you guys, or most of you anyway. Actually, I saw that Richard, you're on the call, so not directly St Clements, but some DNOs and IDNOs will be going qualification, so that's relevant to them. The idea about qualification is that if as a participant or a data service, whatever, as a non-central party, you want to use the end-to-end testing sandbox, which is voluntary. You don't have to use it, but it's an environment that will be provided. So you guys, what you guys will be on the hook for is providing that environment. It will be the same environment that we use to do qualification as we used to do end-to-end sandbox. Rather than having the overheads of two separate environments, we're going to do it both on one, and we will ensure by segregating the data that people are, you know, that things don't get confused between the two. So in order for a participant to get the right to go and do their own testing in the end-to-end sandbox, they have to have successfully completed either the relevant bits of SIT that they're doing, or they have to have done qualification testing. They don't have to have completed all the qualification self-assessment document processes, because that, you know, they can, those can be kind of tidied up towards the end, but they do have to have done the qualification testing before they've got the right to use the sandbox environment.
Yep. Right, any other questions? Obviously, for central parties specifically, we will want to be getting much closer to you in the coming weeks in terms of your actual plans. And as Kate mentioned earlier, we'd like to represent more of those specific plans in the next iteration, so that we can be clearer about the paths through this. And obviously, since you need to be ready to support component integration testing, and it does help define how quickly we can get SIT started, we need to understand those plans, your plans, in the context of this plan, and how well those two will align. So in the coming days and weeks, we will want to have a more granular conversation with central parties who are providing capabilities to support the critical path, just to have a better understanding of risk, where we don't already have those conversations going at this stage. So this should provide a good backdrop for this. Obviously, your consultation responses will give us a lot of the information that we're looking to get in any case. Did anybody have any? Oh, Matt, hand up.
Sorry, a really quick one.
Yeah.
When we look at PoaP 2, are we to assume the same activities are happening in, but there's just compressed timelines? It's easier for us to assess Plan 1 at the moment because there's a level of detail beneath it.
There is. I mean, materially, it's the approach to getting SIT started is going to be different, which will obviously doesn't affect. Well, it will affect central parties in the, you know, there's pressure to try and start SIT earlier, which puts pressure on everybody to be ready earlier. But for participants that in SIT, we are, you know, we're looking to, for example, suppliers and agents, we want to see who's getting through their DBT earlier, and potentially then picking a cross section, again, a minimum viable cohort of parties that would start SIT earlier, and then everybody else would not go through SIT. They would have to go through qualification. So it does put pressure on parties to be getting through their DBT more quickly. So it's a more radical, more incentivized approach for.
Yeah, but the big moves aren't in SIT moving forward, though, are they? The big differential in timeline is at the end. I'm less concerned from a Helix perspective around SIT starting slightly earlier.
Exactly, yeah.
Than I am about the compression of some of the other activities following.
Yes, I think we're very clear that there is no underpinning evidence. We've taken out all the contingency that we had in the illustrative timeline, and we've taken a very optimistic view of risk and how that risk can be managed. So there's no evidence at this stage. It is just a logical sequencing with if the other one was a kind of medium fat, this is a very low fat approach to delivering this one. It's more of a device to really put pressure on the questioning and the answering through the consultation process about and as I say, provide the basis for a range of dates, that kind of thinking.
Okay, cool.
Matt,
effectively same activities, just short time then.
Yeah.
Matt, while we're talking about the back end activities, we have had a discussion with Karen as well on the implications around qualification, because we've retained, and we did talk about this morning in our briefing with the suppliers, that we've retained the 12-month period for qualification execution because we have no rationale or evidence to change that at the moment. So we have asked Karen to look at what the implication is for executing qualification, for the number of participants we might have, etc. And I think the assumption would be that we would have more participants going through qualification on the challenge timeline as well. So just to highlight that to you and make you aware that I think that we spoke to Karen about that as well.
Yeah, I think I was on that. I was on one of those calls last week.
Yeah, I thought you were. I did so many calls, can't remember who was on all of them. Sorry, Matt.
No. Cool.
Steve?
It's around this time, it's at the beginning of SIT. So you mentioned there's an incentive for suppliers and other participants to get on with the DBT. There's also, by the look of this, a significant disincentive to bother, because if you don't get selected, you're screwed.
There's always there's always a pro and a con with these.
No, exactly, and therefore
the
problem with this one from a external non-central systems is you can put the effort in, whatever your selection process is. Again, going back to the migration, in theory, the migration DBT hasn't been completed. But if you get selected, whoopee. If you don't get selected, then you've got, unlike PoaP 1, you sit around twiddling your thumbs for 15 months. I'm just trying to understand why that's that kind of approach of, no other PPs will go through SIT. We'll select who we select based on some, I'll be honest, internally provided, etc., etc. And you may find that once you start SIT, actually, somebody's not quite got it right.
Well, it might be a combination of things. The thoughts on each of these PoaPs can get mixed together. So the illustrative timeline allowed for participants who didn't go the fast track SIT could still do SIT. So there's always, there are elements of both approaches that might constitute legitimate ways to run whatever ends up being the baseline plan. So a way to mitigate it would be to allow other people to do SIT. And there's no reason why there might be a hybrid kind of selection of different approaches from these two PoaPs to get something that's more practical. So you're right, there is always a pro and a con. And we just have to, at some point, we'll have to make a decision about the least bad approach for this.
Yeah, it's just the incentive versus kind of almost like a cliff edge.
It would be useful just to have your feedback in the consultation response against this version of the plan, Steve, and the comparative merits between this and the other. So that would be really useful.
It's the selection and then who goes forward and how that's organised is the main kind of point around that. It's not necessarily the timeline per se for this point.
Well, I think the selection criteria that get applied would be, they would be developed through program governance. They would be visible and transparent. We couldn't tell you what they are now because there would have to be an exercise to go through to pick those. But yeah, you have to make some assumptions around this, Steve.
Got a new hand, Matt.
It is. It's my other hand.
Yeah.
So I hadn't picked up on what Steve was talking about, but is that likely to get some pushback from suppliers? Because you're right, if there's an incentive to deliver early, unless you miss it, but there's also, if you get deselected from that process, you lose what, maybe 6 months of early adoption and competitive advantage in the new market.
Yeah.
I wonder whether that's going to create some resistance from some of the suppliers.
Yeah, but I would expect that it would provide some a basis for some pushback, and that's fine as well, because say we might end up picking the best bits of the approaches from the two rationales. I think it's somewhere in between the two. But if this is the kind of extreme and the other one is the more likely, then there might be a range between, and we just need to settle on the almost the least bad approach, because it's very complex and nobody's going to be happy with entirely. Not everybody's going to be happy with any approach we pick in the end. But yeah, on the balance of feedback, we may well be then guided on what's the right way forward in any plan we end up telling people that we're intending to proceed with.
Yeah.
And the only other comment would be, is there any reason for that MVP migration to be 12 months? For example, that could be an incentive that says you can start early, but you get the same amount of time. You get the same end date as everybody else, which means you get a bit extra time to migrate, on the basis that the first few months might be a bit problematic, whereas the non-SIP people get through. Theory, the 12 months might be when all the issues have been resolved for migration.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Steve. I don't see any reason why you shouldn't get longer if you go in early, and that's a good incentive for those who've got very large populations to move to actually do that. Yeah. Okay. So I
think that's a natural consequence, and actually that's one of the advantages to going through early in the illustrative PoaP above and this one. But at the moment we've kept it to 12 months to try and tease out how long people think migration will take. So if we're assuming that it takes 12 months and parties come back and say, not on your Nelly, it's going to take 12 months to do the bulk and 12 months to do the tail, that's the sort of feedback we want to tease out through the consultation as well. So that's why we've kept the 12 months in this version of the plan, is to try and get feedback on what a practical length for migration is. And we are having those discussions through the migration working group and bilaterally as well.
Okay, an absence of questions. We've always said that as a result of these sessions, in any case, if you would like to speak to us bilaterally, or you have a question, that you just shoot it through to the PMO and it'll get directed to the right people in the interim before the consultation response deadline is at the end of next week. So we are available and ready to help you and support you. And if there are conversations you want to have or information you need, then just get in contact with us through the PMO mailbox. And we will deal with that. As I say, based on questions that are coming up in the 6 playback sessions we have today and tomorrow, we are intending to just summarise the kind of the questions that have been asked and the answers that we have at this stage, which might be also beneficial for people who haven't been able to get on these calls. Are there any questions about evidence provision, or anything about the consultation question responses? Any kind of process related questions anybody or concerns anybody has in meeting in terms of the context of the deadline being next week, end of next week? Anybody concerned about being able to provide the evidence to support? Is there any lack of clarity on evidence? Anything like that? Obviously, we put a slide in the pack on this. We did ask Ofgem about evidence and what they would expect to see, and primarily they're looking for plans. Plans are the best evidence and the better information. So provision of plans and information related to plans is the best way of supporting your point of view. I think that was, the first, second, and third priorities for Ofgem were see the plan. So if you don't have plans, but you're developing them, and I know everybody has to have developed a higher level plan at least by M3, which is the end of next month. If you don't have plans, then one would imagine that you're developing plans and that you can provide thinking based on that planning development that you're doing. So again, it's important to try to evidence things on that quantifiable basis as much as you can. And I think, you know, it's more likely that the central parties are in a better position for this, one would expect, than possibly some other parties who are playing catch up. But the same requirement is on everybody to provide that quantifiable information. I think the message was very clearly made at the open day by Rachel, and we haven't really changed that point. It is a challenge, we know, but we can't build this plan without you. That's the point. If there's an absence of information, we're going to struggle to get the right basis for a realistic delivery plan that everybody can buy into. And we want to learn the lessons from other programs. We don't want to put a plan in place that, you know, people behind the scenes are just saying, nah, that's not going to work. We can't be in that position. We've got to give ourselves the best shot and yourselves the best shot of making this work, but quickly. The message has not gone away. We have to do it as quickly as possible. Right, hand up, Matt.
Sorry, I promise I hope this is the last one.
Sorry, at least you're asking questions. That's good.
So we can provide a plan for DBT. I don't think that's a challenge. But I don't think that delivers you much value because we probably won't be challenging the October or the 23 timeline. But our challenge, I don't know whether Lee agrees, is the post DBT stuff. There's so much, there's so little detail that we have around what's involved in the activities, how many participants are being going through, how many environments we need to have spun up. We don't really know at the moment whether those timescales are realistic, given the number of participants that may or may not be going through it, and the amount of activity that we're expecting to do as central parties through those periods. So evidence I think we could provide. I don't know whether it would be in plan for that.
Well, it's perfectly legitimate for you to put in your response the evidence you want from us, the information you want from us. So absolutely, you know, don't hold back. Shoot with both barrels. If you think we're not providing the right information, say so in the response, and we have to kind of iterate the plan to respond to those points. So yeah, absolutely, that's fine.
There are some assumptions that you can make, though, informed assumptions you can make, Matt, on, you know, number of licensed suppliers who might be coming through qualification now, for example, you know, the number of competitive agents operating in these in similar markets now. So I think, you know, we're making lots of assumptions. I think you can make some assumptions to help quantify some of the impact on this as well. I mean, we're 3 years out from this, so it's you know, this is why we've been trying to document our raid as we go along, because we have to make assumptions on this, because it would be mad to be pinning down some of the information around activities that are going to happen in 3 years' time. We're going to learn a lot more over that time, I hope.
Yeah, and one other thing I would say is that we want to get to baseline plan as soon as we can, because it makes it a lot easier for everybody to have the same expectations and to be on the same page. But we won't rush the planning process unnecessarily, because we need to get it right as much as possible. So that's why we've left a gap between round 2 and round 3. We need to circle back round the key stakeholders, the senior stakeholders in the programme, and we need to ask ourselves, are we pushing this planning process too fast and there's too much uncertainty at this stage? We do need to get to a baseline plan, but it's got to be solid enough basis for us to be all singing from the same sheet at that stage. So, and I would say that we'll be sensible about this. We have to see what the output and the conclusions of round 2 are, and then we need to see where we are. And then the next steps will become clearer.
Okay.
So let us know if you've got questions in the meantime, but we look forward to your responses, and thank you for joining us. We appreciate your time.